When a new black family moved into a suburban neighborhood, they expected the usual introductions and quiet living. Instead, the HOA board, led by a woman notorious for micromanaging every detail, slapped them with a $5,000 fine. The charge? Suspicious activity. But what the HOA didn't realize was that the couple wasn't just another family settling in. They were both sitting federal judges, and when they decided to respond, the entire board, and especially Karen, were left stunned. The Jeffersons were not the kind of family that drew attention. Jonathan and Denise Jefferson had spent their lives in public service, working tirelessly to uphold the law and treat people with fairness and dignity. They weren't flashy. They didn't flaunt their accomplishments. To anyone passing by, they looked like a hard-working couple with 2 teenage kids and a Labrador retriever. What nobody in their new neighborhood knew, at least not yet, was that both Jonathan and Denise were federal judges. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who had nothing to prove, but they preferred to leave their titles and status at the courthouse. At home, they wanted to be simply neighbors, parents, and homeowners. When they bought their 2-story brick house in a suburban development, they were looking for peace. They had chosen the neighborhood carefully. Safe streets, good schools for their kids, and a community that appeared welcoming. The house itself was modest by their standards, spacious but not extravagant. They loved the wide front porch, the backyard with room for their dog, and the tree-lined street where children rode bikes in the afternoons. Their first week was filled with the usual settling-in routines: unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, setting up internet service. They waved at neighbors when they saw them, introduced themselves to a few folks walking dogs, and even hosted a small barbecue to meet the families nearby. Most people responded warmly. A few seemed reserved, but nothing out of the ordinary. And then there was Karen. Karen held a seat on the HOA board, a position she treated as though it gave her authority over every inch of the neighborhood. Tall, sharp-featured, with a clipped tone and a clipboard never far from reach, she was the kind of person who noticed everything and had an opinion about it all. Whether it was the color of someone's mulch or how long a car was parked in the street, Karen made it her mission to enforce rules with almost military precision. Her first interaction with the Jeffersons was telling. When Denise waved from the driveway one morning, Karen glanced at her but didn't return the greeting. Instead, she eyed the Jeffersons' garage, where boxes were still stacked from the move, and muttered something under her breath before walking off. At first, Jonathan and Denise brushed it aside. Not everyone was friendly, and they didn't expect instant connections with every neighbor. But as the days passed, Karen's disapproval became more obvious. She made a point of walking slowly past their house, jotting notes on her clipboard. She paused when delivery trucks came by, scribbling in her notebook as though each package required documentation. One Saturday evening, the Jeffersons hosted a small gathering for family and a few close friends. Nothing wild, just food, conversation, and music at a respectful volume. By 9 o'clock, things were winding down. Yet before the last guest had even left, Karen appeared on their front lawn, arms crossed. "Parties are supposed to be registered with the HOA," she said curtly. "We've had complaints about noise and traffic." Jonathan, calm as always, replied evenly. "It was just family, Karen. We kept it quiet and ended early. No laws or rules broken." Karen didn't argue further, but the look she gave them said it all. She was watching. Over the following weeks, her behavior grew bolder. One afternoon, she knocked on their door to comment on how long Jonathan's car had been parked in the driveway. Another time, she told Denise that porch lights left on past midnight gave the wrong impression. She even suggested that people were talking about the number of visitors coming to the Jeffersons' home, relatives, colleagues, and friends who came by occasionally. The implication was clear. Karen wasn't just nitpicking. She was framing the Jeffersons as outsiders, as though their presence was somehow suspicious. The Jeffersons tried to keep their patience. They knew better than most how power could be abused when left unchecked. In court, they had both seen cases where authority was twisted to target people unfairly, but experiencing it in their own neighborhood, from someone with no real authority beyond an HOA title, was another matter. Despite Karen's antics, the Jeffersons continued living their lives with dignity. Their kids joined local sports teams, they attended community events, and they made genuine connections with neighbors who appreciated their warmth. Slowly, whispers about Karen's behavior began surfacing. Other families admitted she had harassed them too, over trivial things like mailbox colors or holiday decorations. Still, Karen seemed especially fixated on the Jeffersons. Perhaps it was because they were new. Perhaps it was because she didn't like the sight of a successful black family in what she considered her neighborhood. Or perhaps it was simply her nature, to pick the easiest target and push until she felt in control. Whatever the reason, Karen's disapproval escalated into formal complaints. At the next HOA meeting, she raised her hand and declared that the Jeffersons were engaging in suspicious activity that was disrupting the neighborhood. When pressed to explain, she cited things like unfamiliar cars in the driveway and lights on at unusual hours. Most of the board shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the flimsiness of her claims. But Karen was relentless, insisting that the HOA had a duty to protect the integrity of the community. By the end of the meeting, she had pushed through a motion to fine the Jeffersons $5,000 for violating vague community standards. When Jonathan and Denise received the official notice, they read it twice to make sure they weren't misunderstanding. A $5,000 fine for suspicious activity. No details, no evidence, just the weight of Karen's word. Their teenage son, reading over their shoulders, asked, "Can they even do that?" Jonathan closed the letter and set it aside. "Not legally," he said calmly, "but we'll let them think they can." For years, the Jeffersons had enforced the law with fairness, ensuring justice for those who needed it most. They weren't about to let a petty HOA board member trample on their rights. They had dealt with seasoned attorneys, prosecutors, and entire legal teams. Karen and her clipboard didn't intimidate them one bit. But instead of reacting in anger, they chose patience. They would respond, but not in the way Karen expected, because what she didn't know was that the people she had just fined weren't ordinary homeowners. They were federal judges, and they were about to show the entire HOA what real authority looked like. The fine notice sat on the Jeffersons' kitchen counter like a piece of rotten fruit. It wasn't the money that bothered them. Jonathan and Denise could afford $5,000 without blinking. It was the principle. They had dedicated their careers to upholding justice, ensuring fairness, and protecting citizens from arbitrary authority. Now, in their own neighborhood, they were on the receiving end of exactly the kind of abuse they'd spent decades dismantling in court. Denise, calm but firm, drafted their first response. It was a letter addressed to the HOA board, requesting a full explanation of the fine. She asked for documented evidence of the alleged suspicious activity, citations from the community bylaws that supported such a charge, and a breakdown of how the $5,000 figure had been determined. She ended the letter with a polite but pointed reminder. As homeowners, we are entitled to transparency and due process. When the board received the letter, the reaction was mixed. Some members were uncomfortable with the fine from the beginning, but had gone along to avoid confrontation with Karen. Others were simply indifferent, preferring to let Karen run the show. But Karen, of course, took the Jeffersons' letter as a direct challenge. At the next meeting, she waved the letter in the air like evidence of a crime. "They're trying to intimidate us," she snapped. "They think they can question the authority of this board. We can't let that happen. If we back down now, every homeowner will think they can get away with anything." One of the quieter board members shifted uncomfortably. "But Karen, they're right. We don't really have grounds for this fine. There isn't anything in the bylaws about—" Karen cut him off. "Suspicious activity falls under community standards. It's about the safety of the neighborhood. Don't tell me you haven't noticed all the cars coming and going at their house." The others didn't argue further, but the doubt in their eyes was obvious. Meanwhile, word of the fine spread through the neighborhood. Some residents whispered about the Jeffersons behind closed doors, wondering if maybe Karen was right. Others approached Jonathan and Denise directly, expressing quiet support but admitting they didn't want to cross Karen. It was a familiar dynamic, the loudest person in the room setting the tone while everyone else stayed silent. Jonathan and Denise, however, weren't rattled. They knew better than to fight this battle with emotion. They treated it like a case file, methodically gathering information. They requested minutes from HOA meetings, copies of correspondence, and financial records showing how fines were handled. They also reviewed their community's bylaws in detail, highlighting every section relevant to their situation. It didn't take long to uncover glaring issues. The bylaws mentioned noise, property upkeep, and parking. But there was nothing about suspicious activity. The fines for actual violations were capped at $500, not $5,000. And nowhere did the board have the authority to impose penalties without documented proof or a hearing. When the Jeffersons sent their second letter, it was sharper than the first. They laid out each inconsistency clearly, referencing bylaws by section and line. They demanded that the fine be rescinded immediately, or the HOA would be in violation of its own governing documents. Karen was livid. She called the Jeffersons troublemakers and accused them of trying to lawyer their way out of accountability. She began showing up at their property more often, sometimes standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, glaring as if she could will them into submission. Her obsession didn't go unnoticed. A few neighbors started murmuring that Karen had gone too far this time. One even joked, "If anyone's suspicious, it's her, always lurking around with that clipboard." But Karen refused to back down. She doubled her efforts, filing new complaints about the Jeffersons. She claimed their son's basketball hoop was a safety hazard. She complained that their dog barked too loudly when mail was delivered. She even said their porch light was too bright and disrupted the harmony of the neighborhood. Each complaint was more absurd than the last, but Karen submitted them all in writing, pressing the board to act. Most members rolled their eyes but stayed quiet, wary of her temper. The Jeffersons, for their part, didn't rise to the bait. They continued responding calmly with facts and documentation. They didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't even raise their voices. But behind their patience was a quiet strategy. What Karen didn't realize was that every letter she sent, every baseless complaint she filed, was being documented by two people who knew exactly how to build a case. Jonathan and Denise weren't just defending themselves, they were gathering evidence. By this point, Denise had started drafting a formal brief. She cited federal and state statutes about discrimination, abuse of authority, and harassment. She outlined the legal risks the HOA exposed itself to by imposing unlawful fines. Jonathan, meanwhile, compiled a timeline of every action Karen had taken against them, cross-referencing each one with the bylaws she claimed to be enforcing. They didn't plan to unleash it all at once. Timing mattered. In the courtroom, they both knew the value of patience, the dramatic reveal, the final word that silences the opposition, and that was exactly how they intended to handle Karen and her board. But Karen, oblivious to who she was really dealing with, thought she was winning. One evening she approached Jonathan in his driveway, her tone dripping with smugness. "You think your fancy letters are going to scare me? I've been on this board for 10 years. I know how things work around here. You don't." Jonathan simply smiled, wiping his hands on a rag as he looked her in the eye. "Karen, I promise you, we know exactly how things work." The calmness of his tone unsettled her more than any angry outburst could have. She stormed off, muttering under her breath. But for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. The Jeffersons knew the breaking point was near. The board had scheduled another meeting to address ongoing concerns, and Karen was pushing hard to make it all about them. But this time, Jonathan and Denise were ready, and when they finally decided to reveal who they were, Karen's crusade would crumble in an instant. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and the Jeffersons walked into the clubhouse with the same quiet composure they brought into their courtrooms. The room was buzzing. Neighbors had heard whispers of the conflict and came curious to see how it would play out. Some were openly sympathetic, offering polite nods and smiles as Jonathan and Denise entered. Others avoided eye contact, not wanting to be caught on the wrong side of Karen's wrath. Karen sat at the front, flanked by the other board members. She looked more determined than ever, her stack of papers spread out in front of her like ammunition. The gavel in her hand tapped the table sharply as she called the meeting to order. "Tonight," she announced, her voice carrying across the room, "we're here to address the continued issues surrounding the Jefferson household. For weeks there have been complaints, noise, traffic, questionable activity. This is not the kind of behavior that maintains the standards of our community." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few neighbors exchanged skeptical glances. But Karen pressed on. "The board has already levied a fine," she continued. "And instead of complying, the Jeffersons have chosen to challenge our authority. This sets a dangerous precedent. If one family believes they can ignore the rules, what stops anyone else from doing the same?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, expression neutral. Denise rested her hands on the table, calm and poised. They didn't interrupt. They let Karen talk, let her dig herself deeper. Karen shifted to the stack of complaints she'd filed, reading each one as though it were gospel. She spoke of late-night visitors, unfamiliar vehicles, lights left on until early morning. She even held up a photo she had taken of Jonathan unloading groceries at night, presenting it as evidence of unusual behavior. By the time she finished, the room was silent, not because anyone was convinced, but because the pettiness of her accusations had become impossible to ignore. That was when Denise stood. "Thank you, Karen," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Now, with respect to the board and our neighbors, it's our turn to respond." She opened a folder and pulled out neatly organized documents. Her tone remained calm, but there was an edge of authority behind every word. First, regarding the $5,000 fine. According to the community bylaws, Section 4, subsection C, fines cannot exceed $500 for any violation. Furthermore, Fines may only be issued for documented breaches of rules explicitly stated in the bylaws. Nowhere in these bylaws does the term suspicious activity appear. Not once. She handed copies of the bylaws to the board members, each page marked with highlights and tabs. The room stirred as neighbors leaned in, reading for themselves. Jonathan then stood, continuing seamlessly. Second, due process. The bylaws also require that any homeowner accused of a violation must be given notice and an opportunity for a hearing before penalties are imposed. We received neither. Instead, a fine was levied arbitrarily, without evidence, without authority, and without procedure. He placed his own packet of documents on the table. Letters they had written, timelines of events, copies of Karen's complaints. Every detail was meticulously documented, every statement backed by proof. Karen's face tightened, but she forced a smirk. You think you can come in here and twist words around? This isn't a courtroom. This is our community. We make the rules. Denise's eyes locked on hers, unwavering. Karen, rules only matter when they're applied fairly. Otherwise, they're nothing but tools of harassment. The crowd murmured louder this time. People were shifting in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with Karen's stance. Some whispered to each other, eyebrows raised, already siding with the Jeffersons. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. You've accused us of suspicious activity. I'll tell you what's suspicious. Targeting one family repeatedly, inventing violations that don't exist, and imposing fines that aren't supported by any governing document. That's suspicious, and it's also unlawful. Karen's smirk faltered, her knuckles whitening around the gavel. Unlawful? Please, don't be dramatic. This is just a neighborhood disagreement. Denise exchanged a brief glance with Jonathan before speaking again. Karen, you may not know this, but Jonathan and I deal with questions of law every single day. We understand due process. We understand what authority boards like this do and do not have. And more importantly, we understand when that authority crosses the line into discrimination. The words landed like a thunderclap. The room froze, neighbors turning to stare at the Jeffersons. Jonathan didn't blink. Denise didn't flinch. They let the silence hang, heavy and undeniable. Then Jonathan added, his voice low but firm. We are both federal judges, and we will not be bullied. The effect was immediate. Gasps rippled through the room. Board members' eyes widened. Even the neighbors who had been hesitant looked stunned. The calm, polite couple Karen had treated as easy targets were suddenly revealed to be two of the highest-ranking legal authorities in the country. Karen's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The smug confidence she had carried into the meeting evaporated in an instant. Jonathan straightened his papers and continued, his tone professional but pointed. If this fine is not rescinded immediately, if this harassment does not stop, we are prepared to take legal action. That action would not only involve this board, but also every individual who knowingly supported unlawful conduct. I trust that none of you want to find yourselves explaining this to a federal court. The room was silent, except for the nervous shifting of papers and the occasional cough. One board member quickly cleared his throat and spoke up. I think we need to, revisit this fine. Perhaps rescind it entirely. Clearly there's been a mistake. Another nodded eagerly. Yes, no need to escalate. We can resolve this. Karen sat frozen, her gavel still clutched in her hand but useless now. The power she had wielded so freely had been stripped away with a single revelation. Denise gave a polite smile. We're not here to embarrass anyone. We're here to live peacefully in this community, just like everyone else. But peace requires fairness. It requires respect, and that respect must be mutual. With that, the Jeffersons gathered their papers and sat down, their point made, their authority unshaken. The meeting moved on, but the energy in the room had shifted permanently. Karen was no longer in control. The Jeffersons were, and the neighborhood knew it. The tension in the room lingered long after the Jeffersons finished speaking. The board, once accustomed to letting Karen dominate the meetings, suddenly looked like a group of schoolchildren caught cheating on a test. Some shuffled their papers nervously. Others avoided eye contact with Jonathan and Denise altogether. Karen, however, couldn't sit in silence forever. She slammed the gavel down harder than necessary and forced out a shaky laugh. Well, she said, her voice brittle, I think we're all overreacting a little. No need to throw around titles to scare people. This is a neighborhood issue, nothing more. Her attempt at brushing it off only made things worse. One neighbor in the back called out, Karen, you've been harassing them for weeks. None of this ever made sense. And now we know why. They've been right the whole time. Others nodded in agreement. A quiet murmur spread, louder this time, but this time it wasn't gossip. It was pushback. The tide had turned. Jonathan didn't rise to her bait. He simply looked at the board and said, "This fine needs to be removed from the record tonight, and there should be a written acknowledgement that the HOA acted improperly." The head of the board, who until now had let Karen take the reins, finally spoke up. His voice was measured, but his eyes flicked nervously toward Karen. "I agree. It's clear this fine wasn't supported by our bylaws. I motion to rescind it immediately." The vote was quick. Every hand went up except Karen's. She gripped the gavel tightly, her face flushing red as the realization hit her. She was outnumbered. "The motion passes," the head announced. "The fine is rescinded." Applause broke out, soft at first, then louder as more neighbors joined in. The Jeffersons didn't bask in it, but the look of relief and vindication was clear on their faces. Their patience, their restraint, their professionalism. It had all paid off. Karen, on the other hand, was unraveling. "You can't just overturn this," she snapped. "They're manipulating all of you. They think because they're judges, they can live above the rules." "Well, not in my neighborhood." Her words hung in the air, desperate and hollow. This time, nobody clapped for her. Nobody nodded in support. Even her closest allies on the board shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to stand with her. Denise leaned forward, her voice calm but carrying weight. "Karen, we don't live above the rules. We live by them. That's the difference between us and you. The rules apply to everyone, or they mean nothing." That simple statement cut through the room like a blade. Neighbors who had once feared Karen now stared at her with open disdain. One woman shook her head and whispered loudly enough to be heard, "She's embarrassed us all." Karen's jaw tightened, but she had no retort. For the first time, she seemed small, stripped of the false authority she'd built her identity around. The meeting continued, but it was clear nothing else mattered. Every agenda item felt perfunctory, every discussion overshadowed by the clash that had just unfolded. When it finally adjourned, neighbors gathered in small groups, buzzing about what they'd witnessed. The Jeffersons were approached by several families who offered support, apologies, and even congratulations for standing up to Karen. One man admitted quietly, "We've all wanted to put her in her place for years. Took you 2 weeks to do what the rest of us couldn't." Jonathan smiled politely, though he didn't gloat. Sometimes all it takes is reminding people what the rules actually say. Karen, meanwhile, stormed out of the clubhouse, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. She didn't say goodbye, didn't look back. The gavel she usually carried like a badge of honor was left behind on the table, forgotten in her rush to escape the humiliation. That night, as the Jeffersons walked home, their children asked the question that had been hanging in the air. "Is she going to leave us alone now?" Denise glanced at Jonathan, then answered with quiet certainty, "She doesn't have a choice." And she was right. Over the next few days, the neighborhood atmosphere shifted. Where there had once been tension and suspicion, there was now warmth. Neighbors waved more readily, stopped for chats on the sidewalk, even brought over baked goods as peace offerings. The Jeffersons were no longer outsiders. They had earned respect, not by force, but by standing firm in the face of unfair treatment. Karen, on the other hand, found her influence crumbling. The board grew distant, reluctant to back her after what had happened. Homeowners she once intimidated began questioning her authority openly. At the next HOA meeting, she tried to raise a minor issue about someone's flower bed, and half the room rolled their eyes. The balance of power had shifted. The Jeffersons didn't rub it in. They didn't bring up their titles again, nor did they treat anyone differently. They simply lived their lives, grilling in the backyard, attending their kids' games, walking their dog. Their dignity spoke louder than anything else. But Karen's downfall wasn't complete yet. The climax of her undoing came a few weeks later, when a petition circulated quietly around the neighborhood. It called for her removal from the HOA board, citing abuse of authority, harassment of residents, and misuse of power. The signatures piled up faster than anyone expected. By the time the board convened to review the petition, the outcome was inevitable. Karen's seat was stripped, her title gone. She walked out of that meeting without her gavel, without her clipboard, and without the false authority she'd clung to for years. For the Jeffersons, it was the ultimate vindication. They hadn't just defended themselves, they had restored fairness to the entire community. And for Karen, the woman who had once fined them $5,000 for nothing more than existing in her neighborhood, the fall from power was complete. With the fine erased and Karen removed from the HOA board, life in the neighborhood finally settled. The Jeffersons became respected members of the community, not because of their titles, but because they showed strength without arrogance and dignity without fear. Karen, once the self-appointed enforcer of the neighborhood, was left isolated. Without her board position, her power vanished, and the same neighbors who once bowed to her now kept their distance. For the Jeffersons, the lesson was simple. Rules only matter when applied fairly, and power is meaningless when it's abused. Karen had tried to weaponize the HOA against them, but in the end, her actions only exposed her own weakness. The family moved forward peacefully, and the neighborhood, finally free of Karen's iron grip, was better for it.